When modern planners promise to solve ancient problems with fresh theories, they reveal a peculiar blindness, the assumption that accumulated human experience amounts to nothing more than prejudice awaiting correction. This confident dismissal of traditional practices represents one of the most dangerous delusions of our time, the belief that abstract reasoning can improve upon the tested wisdom of generations. Yet observe what actually happens when we attempt to replace inherited practices with rationally designed alternatives. The results consistently confound our expectations. Urban planners demolish organic neighborhoods to create efficient housing projects that become centers of social dysfunction. Educational theorists replace time-tested methods of learning with innovative approaches that leave students less capable of thinking clearly. Social engineers redesign institutions according to scientific principles, only to discover they have destroyed the very foundations that made those institutions work. This is not mere coincidence. There exists a profound difference between the kind of knowledge embedded in traditional practices and the abstract knowledge that modern theories claim to provide. Today, I want to explore why this ancient wisdom, tested through countless generations of human experience, offers more reliable guidance than the most sophisticated contemporary theories. Chapter 1: The Inheritance of Practical Wisdom. Traditional practices represent something far more valuable than mere habit or superstition. They embody what I call practical knowledge, a form of understanding that emerges not from abstract reasoning but from countless generations of human beings grappling with the complexities of actual life. This knowledge is not written in textbooks or codified in theories, it lives in the practices themselves, in the accumulated wisdom of how things are actually done. Consider the art of conversation. No theory can adequately capture what makes for genuinely engaging dialogue. The knowledge required, when to speak and when to listen, how to balance disagreement with civility, when humor illuminates and when it offends, this understanding develops through participation in an inherited practice of civilized discourse. We learn it not by studying rules but by entering into a tradition of conversation that has been refined over centuries. The same principle applies to political life. Constitutional arrangements that endure do so not because they conform to abstract principles of political science, but because they have proven capable of accommodating the messy realities of human nature and circumstance. The British Constitution, for instance, cannot be reduced to a set of written rules precisely because its genius lies in its capacity to adapt organically to changing conditions while preserving essential continuities. This practical knowledge possesses a crucial characteristic: it is largely tacit. Much of what we know about navigating complex human situations cannot be explicitly articulated. A skilled craftsman cannot fully explain in words how he knows when his work is complete. A wise judge cannot reduce the art of judgment to a formula. This tacit dimension of knowledge explains why traditional practices often embody insights that no theory can adequately capture. When we attempt to replace such practices with rationally designed alternatives, we inevitably lose this accumulated wisdom. The new system may appear more logical on paper, but it lacks the tested resilience that comes from generational refinement. Like a garden that has been cultivated for centuries, traditional practices have been shaped by countless adjustments to local conditions, unexpected challenges, and human limitations. To sweep away such practices in favor of theoretical innovations is to exchange proven reliability for untested speculation. Chapter 2: The Limitations of Abstract Theory. The appeal of abstract theory lies in its promise of certainty and control. Theories offer us the seductive possibility of understanding complex phenomena through simple principles, of predicting outcomes through logical deduction, of solving problems through the application of universal rules. Yet this very appeal reveals theory's fundamental limitation: it achieves clarity by abstracting from the complexity that characterizes actual human experience. Every theory necessarily involves selection and simplification. To make any phenomenon intelligible, we must ignore countless variables, assume certain conditions remain constant, and focus on relationships that can be precisely defined. This process of abstraction is perfectly legitimate for certain purposes. It enables scientific progress and technological innovation. But when we attempt to apply theoretical knowledge to the practical art of living together in political communities, we encounter serious difficulties. Human beings are not theoretical entities. We are complicated creatures shaped by history, culture, emotion, and circumstance. Our motivations are mixed, our knowledge is limited, and our behavior is influenced by factors we ourselves do not fully understand. Any theory that hopes to guide human affairs must somehow account for this irreducible complexity, but the very nature of theoretical thinking pushes us toward oversimplification. Consider economic theory. Even the most sophisticated models must make assumptions about human behavior, that people act rationally, that they possess perfect information, that markets operate efficiently. These assumptions may be useful for certain analytical purposes, but they bear little resemblance to how actual economic life unfolds. Real people make decisions based on incomplete information, emotional impulses, cultural habits, and personal relationships. Markets are shaped by politics, traditions, and historical contingencies that no theory can fully anticipate. The danger arises when we forget that theories are abstractions and begin treating them as complete descriptions of reality. When urban planners design cities based on theories of efficient traffic flow, they may create environments that work well for automobiles but fail to nurture the kind of spontaneous human interactions that make neighborhoods livable. When educators organize curricula according to theories of learning, they may produce systems that appear rational but fail to cultivate the judgment and character that education should foster. This is not to dismiss the value of theoretical understanding altogether. Rather, it is to recognize that theoretical knowledge represents only one mode of understanding among others, and that it cannot replace the practical wisdom embedded in inherited practices. Theory can inform and illuminate, but it cannot substitute for the accumulated experience of generations. Chapter 3: The Organic Development of Wisdom. Perhaps you have noticed how the most enduring human institutions resemble living organisms more than mechanical devices. They grow rather than being constructed. They adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential continuities. They develop internal complexities that cannot be replicated through rational design. This organic quality distinguishes traditional practices from theoretical innovations in ways that illuminate the source of their superior reliability. Traditional practices evolved through what we might call evolutionary selection, not in the biological sense, but through a process of gradual adaptation that preserves what works while allowing unsuccessful variations to fade away. A legal system that endures does so because its procedures have proven capable of achieving justice under changing conditions. A commercial practice that persists demonstrates its utility through competitive pressure. A social custom that survives reveals its contribution to human flourishing through the test of generational transmission. This evolutionary process operates through mechanisms that no individual planner could replicate. Countless people, each responding to immediate circumstances and local knowledge, make adjustments that cumulatively shape the practice. Useful innovations are retained and refined, while harmful modifications are gradually abandoned. The result is a form of collective intelligence that transcends what any single mind could achieve through abstract reasoning. Language provides the clearest example of this organic development. No committee of linguists designed the English language according to principles of logical efficiency. Instead, it evolved through millions of individual speakers, each making small adjustments to communicate more effectively. The result is a communication system of extraordinary subtlety and flexibility, capable of expressing nuances of meaning that no artificial language has ever matched. Grammar emerges from usage rather than preceding it, and the rules of language are discovered rather than imposed. The same principle applies to moral traditions. Ethical practices that endure do so not because they conform to abstract philosophical principles, but because they have proven capable of sustaining communities over time. The prohibition against lying, for instance, reflects not just rational calculation about the consequences of deception, but generations of experience about what kinds of relationships and communities can flourish when people cannot trust one another's words. Traditional practices also possess what we might call redundancy, multiple overlapping mechanisms that serve similar functions. This redundancy appears inefficient from a theoretical perspective, but it provides crucial resilience. When one element fails, others can compensate. A constitutional system with separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and traditional restraints may seem unnecessarily complex, but this very complexity prevents any single failure from destroying the whole system. Modern theories, by contrast, tend toward elegant simplicity. They seek to achieve desired outcomes through the most direct and efficient means possible. But this theoretical elegance often proves brittle when confronted with the unexpected challenges that characterize real life. Chapter 4: Education and the Transmission of Wisdom. The difference between ancient practices and modern theories becomes particularly evident when we consider how knowledge is transmitted from one generation to the next. Traditional education, what I call liberal learning, operates through a fundamentally different logic than contemporary approaches that treat education as a technical enterprise designed to produce specific outcomes. Liberal learning initiates students into a conversation that has been ongoing for centuries. It invites them to encounter the greatest minds of the past not as museum pieces, but as living participants in ongoing discussions about the deepest questions of human existence. When a student reads Plato or Shakespeare, Aristotle or Aquinas, she enters into a dialogue that connects her to the accumulated wisdom of civilization. This is not mere information transfer but participation in a tradition of thinking. Such education cannot be reduced to the acquisition of facts or skills, though it certainly involves both. More fundamentally, it cultivates judgment, the capacity to navigate situations that cannot be solved through the application of rules or formulas. Judgment emerges through practice, through grappling with concrete cases, through gradually developing a sense for what considerations are relevant in particular circumstances. Consider how one learns to appreciate poetry. No amount of theoretical instruction about meter, metaphor, and literary devices can substitute for the slow cultivation of taste that comes from reading great poems with careful attention. We learn to recognize excellence not by memorizing criteria but by developing sensibilities that allow us to distinguish the profound from the merely clever, the authentic from the artificial. This kind of learning takes time. It cannot be accelerated through more efficient methods or technological innovations. Like wine aging or timber seasoning, the development of judgment requires patience and cannot be rushed. Traditional educational practices recognize this truth and structured learning accordingly, with long apprenticeships, careful mentorship, and gradual progression through increasingly sophisticated material. Modern educational theory, however, tends to treat learning as a technical problem to be solved through better methods, clearer objectives, and more precise measurement. Students become consumers of educational services, and teachers become facilitators of learning experiences. The goal is to produce measurable outcomes as efficiently as possible, with success defined by performance on standardized assessments. Yet this technical approach systematically neglects what matters most in education: the cultivation of character, the development of taste, the formation of judgment. These qualities cannot be measured by standardized tests because they emerge through participation in practices that cannot be reduced to explicit techniques. A person of good judgment knows not only what to think but how to think, when to suspend judgment, and how to navigate the complexity and ambiguity that characterize most important human decisions. The consequence of treating education as a technical enterprise is the production of graduates who may possess considerable information and specialized skills but lack the wisdom necessary for thoughtful participation in civil life. They have been trained to apply techniques but not educated to exercise judgment. Chapter 5: The Paradox of Rational Planning. Have you ever wondered why rational planning so often produces results opposite to those intended? This phenomenon reveals a fundamental paradox at the heart of modern attempts to improve human affairs through theoretical innovation. The very rationality that makes planning appear superior to traditional practices contains the seeds of its own failure. Rational planning proceeds from a laudable impulse, the desire to eliminate inefficiency, reduce suffering, and achieve worthy goals through intelligent design. Planners identify problems, analyze their causes, design solutions, and implement reforms intended to produce better outcomes than current arrangements. This approach appears obviously superior to simply accepting inherited practices without question. Yet observe what actually happens when this logic is carried into practice. Urban planners in the mid-20th century identified traditional neighborhoods as inefficient and replaced them with rationally designed housing projects. The result was often increased crime, social isolation, and community breakdown. Educational planners identified traditional methods of instruction as outmoded and replaced them with innovative approaches based on learning theory. The result has frequently been declining literacy and reduced capacity for critical thinking. The source of this paradox lies in the difference between the kind of knowledge that guides rational planning and the kind embedded in traditional practices. Planners necessarily work with explicit, theoretical knowledge, models, data, and principles that can be clearly articulated and logically applied. But traditional practices embody tacit knowledge that cannot be fully captured in theoretical terms. When planners redesign an urban neighborhood, they focus on measurable variables, traffic flow, population density, green space, proximity to services. But they cannot account for the countless informal relationships, customary behaviors, and subtle environmental cues that make a neighborhood function as a community. These elements are not measurable, but they are crucial to the success of the whole. Similarly, when educators redesign curricula according to learning theories, they may optimize for measurable outcomes while inadvertently destroying the conditions that foster genuine intellectual development. The relationship between teacher and student, the atmosphere of the classroom, the rhythm of intellectual discovery, these cannot be programmed but are essential to real education. This suggests that the superiority of traditional practices lies not in their conformity to correct principles, but in their capacity to coordinate countless variables that exceed the reach of explicit planning. They work not because someone designed them to work, but because they have evolved to accommodate the full complexity of human experience. The tragedy of rational planning is that it destroys this accumulated wisdom in the name of improvement. Like a gardener who decides that natural growth is inefficient and attempts to force plants to grow faster through artificial means, rational planners often damage the very systems they intend to improve. This does not mean that all change is harmful or that traditional practices should never be questioned. Rather, it suggests that wise reform respects the complexity of existing arrangements and proceeds gradually, with careful attention to unintended consequences. The art of statecraft lies in knowing when to conserve and when to adapt, how to accommodate necessary changes while preserving essential continuities. Chapter 6: Contemporary Illusions and Ancient Wisdom. Our contemporary moment presents us with particularly vivid illustrations of the tension between theoretical innovation and practical wisdom. Across multiple domains, from technology and social media to governance and education, we witness repeated attempts to solve complex human problems through rational design, often with results that confound our expectations and intentions. Consider the promise of social media to enhance human connection and democratic participation. The theory was compelling: new technologies would break down barriers, enable global communication, and empower individuals to participate more fully in public discourse. Yet the reality has been more complicated. While these platforms have indeed connected people across vast distances, they have also contributed to political polarization, the spread of misinformation, and the erosion of the kind of sustained, thoughtful conversation that democratic life requires. The problem is not with the technology itself, but with the assumption that innovation automatically constitutes improvement. Traditional forms of communication, face-to-face conversation, written letters, local gatherings, had evolved over centuries to include subtle mechanisms for maintaining civility, encouraging careful thought, and fostering genuine understanding. These mechanisms were largely tacit, embedded in customs and manners rather than explicit rules. When we moved conversation to digital platforms designed for efficiency and engagement, we inadvertently eliminated these traditional restraints without replacing them with adequate alternatives. The result is communication that is faster and more far-reaching but often less thoughtful and more destructive of social bonds. Similar dynamics appear in contemporary approaches to governance. The proliferation of regulations, administrative agencies, and technical expertise in government reflects a theoretical belief that complex social problems can be solved through rational administration. Yet this expansion of bureaucratic control often undermines the very social capital and local knowledge necessary for effective governance. Traditional forms of political life, town meetings, local associations, informal networks of mutual aid, had evolved to handle many social functions without centralized coordination. They were inefficient by technocratic standards but effective at maintaining social order and addressing local needs. When these arrangements are displaced by professional administration, we often achieve greater uniformity and procedural fairness while losing the flexibility and responsiveness that characterize traditional governance. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a particularly clear illustration of these dynamics. Public health experts possessed sophisticated theoretical knowledge about disease transmission and prevention, but they often failed to anticipate how their recommendations would interact with the complex social and economic systems they were attempting to influence. Lockdown policies that appeared rational from an epidemiological perspective produced unintended consequences, educational disruption, mental health crises, economic devastation, that sometimes outweighed their intended benefits. This is not to criticize public health expertise, but to illustrate the limitations of any purely technical approach to complex social challenges. Effective governance requires not just scientific knowledge but practical wisdom, the ability to balance competing goods, anticipate unintended consequences, and adapt policies to local circumstances. The antidote to these contemporary illusions lies not in rejecting all innovation, but in recovering respect for the accumulated wisdom embedded in traditional practices. This wisdom can inform and constrain our innovations, helping us to avoid the most serious mistakes that result from overconfidence in theoretical solutions. Chapter 7: Cultivating Practical Wisdom in Modern Life. The recognition that ancient practices often embody superior wisdom to modern theories raises an important question. How do we cultivate and apply this practical wisdom in our own lives and communities? This is not a matter of simply returning to the past, but of learning to distinguish between innovations that genuinely improve human life and those that merely appear to do so. The first requirement is intellectual humility, the recognition that our current knowledge is limited and that previous generations may have understood certain things better than we do. This does not mean uncritical acceptance of everything inherited from the past, but rather careful attention to why particular practices have endured and what functions they might serve that are not immediately obvious. When we encounter traditional practices that seem outdated or inefficient, our first response should be curiosity rather than dismissal. What problem was this practice designed to solve? What knowledge does it embody that might not be captured in contemporary theories? What would we lose if we abandoned it entirely? These questions help us approach tradition with the respect it deserves while remaining open to necessary adaptations. Consider the practice of family dinner. From an efficiency standpoint, this custom seems wasteful. Family members could obtain nutrition more quickly and conveniently through individual arrangements. Yet families that maintain regular shared meals often report stronger relationships, better communication, and more successful transmission of values to children. The practice embodies knowledge about human flourishing that no theory of nutrition or time management can fully capture. The second requirement is developing what I call conversational competence, the ability to participate thoughtfully in ongoing discussions about how we should live together. This involves learning from the greatest minds of the past, not as authorities to be obeyed but as partners in an ongoing conversation about enduring human questions. Reading the classics of political philosophy, literature, and moral reflection helps us understand how thoughtful people have approached fundamental questions across different times and circumstances. This is not antiquarian scholarship but practical education, learning to think well about the choices we face in our own time. The third requirement is attention to local knowledge and particular circumstances. Abstract theories tend toward universal solutions, but practical wisdom recognizes that what works in one context may fail in another. Effective action requires understanding of specific conditions, relationships, and constraints that cannot be captured in general principles. This suggests the importance of strong local institutions, communities where people know one another, understand local conditions, and can experiment with solutions appropriate to their particular circumstances. Such institutions serve as laboratories for practical wisdom, places where theory can be tested against reality and adjusted accordingly. Finally, cultivating practical wisdom requires patience with complexity and ambiguity. Modern culture often demands quick solutions and clear answers, but many important human questions cannot be resolved definitively. Learning to live well with uncertainty, to make good decisions with incomplete information, and to adapt our approaches as circumstances change, these are essential skills that traditional practices can teach us. The goal is not to eliminate innovation but to ensure that our innovations are guided by wisdom rather than mere cleverness, by understanding of human nature rather than abstract theory alone. Conclusion. The enduring contest between ancient practices and modern theories ultimately concerns the kind of knowledge most reliable for navigating human affairs. While theoretical innovation has its place, the accumulated wisdom embedded in traditional practices offers tested guidance that no amount of abstract reasoning can replace. This wisdom teaches us that human flourishing emerges not from rational planning but from participation in inherited forms of life that have proven their worth through generational experience. It reminds us that the art of living together requires judgment rather than mere technique, conversation rather than manipulation, and humility rather than the arrogance of those who believe they can redesign the human condition. As we face the challenges of our own time, we would do well to approach innovation with the caution it deserves, respecting what has been handed down to us while remaining open to adaptations that serve genuine human needs. The goal is not to halt all change but to ensure that our changes enhance rather than diminish the possibility of human flourishing. In a world intoxicated with the promise of technological solutions and rational planning, the cultivation of practical wisdom becomes both more difficult and more essential than ever before.